December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The smoke still rises in black coils above the twisted steel of Battleship Row. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida circles his Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber one final time over the carnage below, counting the burning hulks: Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. The harbor chokes on its own oil, a rainbow slick spreading like a wound across the water. Through his cockpit glass, Fuchida sees what he believes is the death of American naval power in the Pacific. He does not see the 3 aircraft carriers that are not there, hunting somewhere in the open ocean. He does not see the repair facilities that still stand. And he absolutely does not see the silent killers already beginning their work in the deep waters beyond the harbor's mouth. 51 American submarines, scattered across the Pacific like seeds of a terrible harvest yet to come. In this moment of triumph, as Japanese pilots bank their aircraft toward the northwest and the rising sun, they do not yet understand what they have awakened. They do not know that Japan has just declared war on the one nation on Earth that could wage industrial warfare beneath the sea with a ruthlessness that would make the samurai ancestors weep. They do not know that in 4 years their island empire will be strangled, not by battleships or bombers, but by steel tubes sliding through the darkness, hunting the very lifeblood of their civilization, oil. The young pilots returning to their carriers that December morning carried with them the intoxicating certainty of destiny fulfilled. For months, they had trained in the isolated waters of Kagoshima Bay, dropping modified torpedoes in the shallow depths, perfecting the art of surprise. They had been told they were the tip of the spear, the cutting edge of Dai Nippon Teikoku, the greater Japanese empire destined to liberate Asia from Western colonialism and establish the co-prosperity sphere under the benevolent gaze of the emperor. They had seen the American battleships burn, and they believed, with the conviction that only youth and propaganda can provide, that they had broken the back of American power in a single Sunday morning. What they did not know, what their intelligence officers had failed to calculate, what their strategists had catastrophically underestimated, was that America's true strength lay not in the surface fleet they had just crippled, but in the invisible war that was about to begin beneath the waves. Japan, an island nation utterly dependent on imported resources, had just gone to war with a country that would perfect the art of economic strangulation through submarine warfare. And the weapon that would bring Japan to its knees was already sliding beneath the Pacific swells, hunting for the merchant ships and tankers that carried the oil without which the Japanese war machine could not function for even a single month. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, one must first understand the simple, brutal arithmetic of Japan's resource dependency. In 1941, the Japanese home islands produced virtually no oil of their own. Not a single significant domestic oil field existed within Japan proper. Every drop of petroleum that powered the Zero fighters, the Kate torpedo bombers, the battleships, Yamato and Musashi, every gallon that moved the trucks and tanks across China, every barrel that heated homes and powered factories, all of it came from elsewhere. Before the war, approximately 80% of Japan's oil imports came from the United States itself, a dependency that American policymakers had exploited with increasing severity as Japanese aggression in China escalated throughout the 1930s. When President Roosevelt imposed a complete oil embargo on Japan in August 1941, the Imperial High Command faced a simple choice: withdraw from China and Manchuria, abandoning years of conquest and the dream of Asian hegemony, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya by force. They chose force. They chose Pearl Harbor. They chose war. But in making that choice, they gambled everything on a single assumption: that they could secure and defend a maritime supply line stretching thousands of miles from the oil fields of Sumatra, Borneo, and Java back to the home islands, They gambled that American submarines could not sever that lifeline. They were catastrophically wrong. The American submarine force that entered World War II was, on paper, impressive. 51 submarines in the Pacific Fleet, with more under construction. Modern fleet boats like the Gato class, displacing 1,500 tons surfaced, capable of diving to 300 feet, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a deck gun. Boats designed for long-range patrol, with endurance measured in weeks at sea and thousands of miles between refueling. But the reality beneath that impressive facade was a force crippled by obsolete doctrine, defective weapons, and cautious leadership. Pre-war American submarine strategy had focused on fleet actions, with submarines serving as scouts and auxiliary forces to the battleship line. Attacks on merchant shipping, the unglamorous work of commerce raiding, was considered secondary, almost distasteful. The United States Navy had signed the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which imposed restrictions on unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant vessels. American submarine commanders had been trained in careful, methodical approaches, following prize rules that required surfacing, warning, and allowing crews to abandon ship before sinking. These were the rules of civilized naval warfare, the conventions of gentlemen. Pearl Harbor incinerated those conventions in a single morning. Within hours of the attack, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark sent a message to the Pacific Fleet that would transform American submarine warfare, execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings, no prize rules, no mercy. The silent service was unleashed, but having permission to hunt was not the same as having the weapons to kill. The American submarine force carried into battle the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon that represented nearly 2 decades of development and millions of dollars in investment. On paper, it was a marvel, a 3,000-pound weapon with a 643-pound Torpex warhead, capable of speeds up to 46 knots and ranges of 4,000 yards. It was guided by a sophisticated gyroscope system, and most impressively equipped with the Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder, a secret device designed to detonate the warhead beneath the keel of a target ship, breaking its back and sinking it with a single blow. In pre-war tests conducted in the carefully controlled waters off Newport, Rhode Island, the Mark 14 had performed adequately. But those tests had used only 2 live warheads out of over 9,000 practice shots. The magnetic exploder had never been tested with a live warhead at all, deemed too expensive to expend in peacetime. Now, in the desperate early months of the war, American submarine commanders were about to discover that they had been sent to fight with a weapon that was fundamentally, tragically broken. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely, exploding in the torpedo's wake rather than beneath the enemy hull. Contact exploders failed to trigger on impact, the firing pin mechanism too delicate, crushing on contact rather than igniting. Submarine commanders fired spread after spread into perfect firing solutions, watching through periscopes as their torpedoes passed beneath targets, or struck them with dull thuds and no explosion, or detonated too soon in geysers of wasted fury. They returned to base with empty tubes and full patrol reports documenting failure after failure, only to be told by Bureau of Ordnance that the problem was their aim, their approach, their courage. The torpedo, they were assured, was perfect. The problem was the submariners. Commander Lawson P. Ramage, who would later win the Medal of Honor, fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese carrier in perfect conditions during a 1942 patrol. All 8 either ran too deep or failed to explode. Lieutenant Commander Morton C. Mumma, commanding Sailfish, fired 11 torpedoes at various targets in early 1942. None detonated. Lieutenant Commander Tyrrell D. Jacobs, commanding Sargo, achieved a perfect firing position on a Japanese battleship at 1,200 yards range and fired 4 torpedoes. He watched through his periscope as all 4 struck the battleship's hull with audible clangs and failed to explode. The frustration in the submarine force reached mutinous levels. These men were risking their lives, penetrating defended harbors, evading depth-charge attacks, enduring weeks of tension and terror in steel tubes beneath the sea, only to have their weapons betray them at the moment of truth. But the Bureau of Ordnance, protected by peacetime bureaucracy and institutional arrogance, refused to acknowledge the problem. It took 2 years. 2 years of documented failures, of submarine commanders conducting unauthorized field tests, of officers literally removing the magnetic exploders themselves in defiance of regulations, before the Navy finally admitted the Mark 14 was defective and implemented fixes. 2 years during which Japanese merchant ships carried oil and resources with far less interference than they should have faced. 2 years during which the strangling could have begun in earnest, but didn't. Yet even with broken torpedoes and cautious doctrine, American submarines began to draw blood. On December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor, Swordfish sank the Japanese merchant ship Atsuta-san Maru off Hainan Island, the first Japanese ship sunk by American submarine action in World War II. On January 27, 1942, Gudgeon sank submarine I-173 off Midway, the first Japanese submarine sunk in the war. These were small victories, individual ships in an ocean of targets. But they were the beginning. And as American submarine commanders gained experience, as they learned to compensate for the defective torpedoes, as the boldest and most aggressive captains began to emerge and the cautious ones were reassigned, the pace of sinking began to accelerate. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant ships totaling 725,000 tons. Not enough to seriously impact Japan's war effort, but enough to begin forcing changes in Japanese convoy routes, enough to require the diversion of destroyers and aircraft to escort duty, enough to make Japanese merchant sailors look at the horizon with growing unease. The hunt had begun. Meanwhile, Japan's initial conquests had been breathtakingly successful. By mid-1942, Japanese forces controlled the Dutch East Indies oil fields, producing crude at Tarakan, Balikpapan, and Palembang. They controlled the rice paddies of Burma and Indochina. They controlled the rubber plantations of Malaya. They controlled the tin mines, the iron ore, the coal, the resources that would feed the co-prosperity sphere. The problem was getting those resources home. Every barrel of oil extracted from Sumatra had to be loaded onto a tanker, sailed across the South China Sea, past the Philippines, through the Luzon Strait or the Formosa Strait, and into the home islands. Every ton of rubber, every sack of rice, every ingot of metal followed similar routes, maritime highways stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. And in that ocean, invisible and patient, American submarines were learning to hunt. The Japanese merchant fleet that had to carry this cargo numbered approximately 6 million tons of shipping at the war's start. Tankers, freighters, colliers, cargo ships of every description. It seemed like an enormous fleet, sufficient for the task. But maritime logistics are brutal mathematics. Ships must travel empty one way to pick up cargo. They must spend time in port loading and unloading. They must sail at the speed of the slowest ship in a convoy. Weather, mechanical breakdown, and simple distance all constrain how much cargo can actually be moved, and every ship sunk subtracts from that capacity permanently unless replaced, and replacement takes time, resources, and shipyard space that Japan could not spare. The Japanese Imperial Navy had not seriously prepared for the defense of merchant shipping. Convoy doctrine was rudimentary. Anti-submarine warfare tactics were primitive. Destroyers and escort ships were seen as less prestigious than battleships and carriers, and the best officers gravitated toward the glamorous surface fleet, not the unglamorous work of shepherding slow merchantmen. Sonar technology lagged behind Western standards. Depth charge patterns were less sophisticated. And perhaps most critically, Japanese naval doctrine prioritized offensive action. The decisive battle, the climactic engagement over the patient, grinding work of defensive protection. The war Japan wanted to fight was the war of Tsushima Strait, of massed battleships in line ahead, of decisive victory in a single afternoon. The war they got was something else entirely, an exhausting war of attrition where every cargo ship sunk was a blow that could never be recovered, where the slow accumulation of losses would strangle the empire more effectively than any battle fleet, and they were not prepared for it. By 1943, the American submarine force had transformed. The torpedo problems were being fixed, first by deactivating the magnetic exploder, then by correcting the depth-keeping issue, finally by redesigning the contact exploder itself. New fleet boats were entering service at an accelerating rate. Gato and Belau-class submarines rolling out of Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and Mare Island, Naval Shipyard in California. Aggressive commanders like Dudley Mush, Morton Richard O'Kane, Samuel Dealey, and Eugene Fluckey were taking command men who approached submarine warfare not as a chess match, but as a knife fight, who took their boats into shallow waters and defended harbors, who surfaced to use their deck guns when torpedoes ran out, who embodied a ruthless aggression that matched the mission, sink everything that flies the rising sun. The sinkings accelerated. In 1943, American submarines sent 335 Japanese merchant ships to the bottom, totaling 15 million tons. Tankers became priority targets, the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine. When a submarine commander's periscope broke the surface and the silhouette in the crosshairs was a tanker, every other target became secondary. Oil was everything. Without oil, the Zeros could not fly. Without oil, the battleships became steel monuments. Without oil, the trucks stopped, the factories went cold, the war machines seized, and with every tanker that erupted in flame and slipped beneath the waves, Japan's strategic position deteriorated. The Japanese pilots who had been so confident in December 1941 began to notice changes by 1943. Fuel allocations for training flights were reduced. New pilots received fewer hours of flight time before being sent to combat squadrons. The high-octane aviation fuel began to be mixed with lower grades, reducing engine performance. Maintenance schedules were extended because the supply ships carrying spare parts had failed to arrive. No single moment marked the transition. It was a gradual dimming, a slow constriction. But in ready rooms and squadron briefings, in maintenance hangars and fuel depots, Japanese airmen began to realize that something fundamental had changed. The abundance they had expected after seizing the resource zones of Southeast Asia had not materialized. Instead, there was rationing, scarcity, substitution. The oil was being pumped from the wells of Sumatra and Borneo, yes, but it was not arriving. Somewhere between the oil fields and the home islands, the supply chain was hemorrhaging. Ships were leaving port and never arriving. Convoys were disappearing into the vast Pacific. And the name whispered in increasing dread was Sensuikan submarine. One Japanese merchant captain, Tamichi Hara, commanding destroyer Shigure on escort duty, described the experience in his post-war memoir. "We were always watching the horizon, always listening for the sound of torpedoes in the water. You could not see them. You could not predict them. A merchant ship would be steaming along normally, and then there would be an explosion, a column of water, and the ship would be sinking. Sometimes we saw the periscope. Usually we saw nothing. We would drop depth charges, make sonar sweeps, try to hunt the submarine. But the ocean is vast, and the submarine is small and can go deep. By the time we arrived at the location, The submarine was gone, and we were left with lifeboats and debris and burning oil on the water. Then we had to continue the convoy, knowing the submarine might still be there, might be lining up another shot. It was a war of nerves. The submarines were always there, even when we could not see them. Especially when we could not see them. The psychological impact of this invisible threat cannot be overstated. Surface naval combat, for all its terror, at least allows you to see your enemy, to fight back, to maneuver, and shoot. Submarine warfare offers no such comfort. The enemy is invisible, the attack comes without warning, and survival is a matter of luck more than skill. Japanese merchant crews began to refuse assignments on certain routes. Tanker duty became a death sentence assignment that had to be compelled rather than volunteered for. Insurance rates for shipping companies skyrocketed until the government had to nationalize the risk entirely. By 1944, the strangling had become systematic. American submarines operated in coordinated wolf packs, sharing intelligence via radio, setting up patrol lines across known shipping routes, directing each other to targets. Ultra-intelligence. The Allies' ability to decrypt Japanese naval codes meant that American submarine commanders often knew the routes and schedules of Japanese convoys before they left port. Submarines would wait along the projected route, submerge during daylight, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and move into position. The Japanese convoys would arrive like clockwork, and the slaughter would begin. In the Luzon Strait, the choke point between the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea, American submarines turned the waters into a graveyard. The strait was unavoidable. Any ship traveling from Southeast Asia to Japan had to pass through it, and American submarines hunted there with industrial efficiency. One patrol, one boat, multiple targets. Tang, Wahoo, Flasher, Rasher, Barb. The names became legendary, their patrol reports documenting sinking after sinking. Commander Richard O'Kane in Tang sank 24 Japanese ships totaling 93 24 tons in 5 patrols, a record never exceeded. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey in Wahoo pioneered aggressive surface attacks, closing to point-blank range and firing down-the-throat shots at charging escorts. Commander Eugene Fluckey in Barb penetrated harbors, landed shore parties to blow up trains, and once sank an entire convoy in a single night, firing every torpedo aboard in a furious close-range melee. The statistics tell the story in cold numbers. In 1944, American submarines sank 603 Japanese ships totaling 27 million tons. More ships were sunk in that single year than in the previous 3 years combined. By late 1944, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to less than half its 1941 strength. Tanker losses were catastrophic. Of the 122 tankers Japan possessed in December 1941, only 19 remained afloat by August 1945. Every other tanker had been sunk, damaged beyond repair, or was immobilized in port for lack of fuel to sail. The oil that Japan had gone to war to secure was still being extracted from the wells, still being loaded onto tankers in Palembang and Tarakan, but it was not reaching the home islands. The submarines had severed the lifeline. By 1945, oil imports to Japan had been reduced to a trickle, then to nothing. In March 1945, only 3 tankers reached Japan. In April, 2. In May, 1. After that, none. 0. The oil fields Japan controlled were useless if the oil could not be transported. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere had become a prison from which resources could not escape. The effect on Japanese military operations was catastrophic and cascading. Aviation fuel shortages meant that by 1945, Japanese pilots were receiving as little as 40 hours of flight training before being sent into combat, compared to over 500 hours for American pilots. They were taught to take off and land, given rudimentary combat training, and then deployed to face American pilots with years of experience. The result was a massacre in the air. Veteran Japanese pilots, the ones who had attacked Pearl Harbor and fought over China, were dead by 1944, irreplaceable expertise, lost in the grinding attrition of carrier battles and island campaigns. The new pilots, undertrained and flying aircraft, powered by increasingly adulterated fuel, stood no chance. Entire squadrons were wiped out in single engagements. The once feared Zero fighter, which had dominated Pacific skies in 1942, became a death trap by 1945, flown by boys who barely knew how to aim, facing American Hellcats and Corsairs flown by men who had survived a dozen engagements. The desperation led to kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks that required minimal training and turned aircraft into guided missiles. It was not an innovation born of tactical brilliance, but of resource exhaustion. Japan no longer had the fuel to train pilots properly or to conduct sustained air campaigns, so they created a tactic that required only enough fuel for a one-way trip and enough skill to point an aircraft at a target. It was the weapon of an empire being strangled. The Japanese surface fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, became irrelevant, not because it was destroyed in battle, but because it could not sail. The super battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells over 25 miles. It had been designed as the ultimate expression of battleship supremacy, a ship that could single-handedly dominate any engagement. In April 1945, Yamato was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, with only enough fuel for a single voyage, no return trip possible, ordered to beach itself and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. It never reached Okinawa. American carrier aircraft sank it in the East China Sea, and the great ship rolled over and exploded, taking 2,498 men with it. The mission was called Operation Tengo, the Surface Special Attack Operation, and it was a suicide mission not because of tactical necessity, but because Japan did not have enough fuel to bring the ship home. The greatest battleship ever built, rendered impotent by lack of oil, sent to die because it could no longer serve any other purpose. That is what the submarines had accomplished. Not dramatic carrier battles, not climactic gunnery duels, but the slow, invisible strangulation of an empire's ability to function. On the home islands, the civilian population began to starve. Japan had never been self-sufficient in food production. The home islands could feed perhaps 70% of the population in peacetime, with the remainder made up by imports from Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria. With the merchant fleet decimated, those imports stopped. Rice shipments from Southeast Asia, which had been expected to supplement domestic production, never arrived. The cargo ships carrying food were the same cargo ships carrying oil, carrying rubber, carrying every other strategic material, and they were all at the bottom of the Pacific. Rationing became severe. Daily calorie intake for civilians dropped from over 2,000 calories per day in 1941 to less than 1,500 by 1945. In the cities, people began to starve. Children showed signs of malnutrition. Black markets flourished as the official distribution system collapsed. Factories reduced working hours because workers were too weak from hunger to perform physical labor. The government launched campaigns encouraging people to eat acorns, sawdust, and food substitutes that had no nutritional value. The abundance that Japanese propaganda had promised when the co-prosperity sphere was established had become a cruel joke. The resources existed in Manchuria, in China, in Southeast Asia, but they might as well have been on the moon. The submarines had ensured they could not be transported. Japan was starving in the midst of a theoretically resource-rich empire, cut off from its conquests by American submarines that patrolled every shipping lane, every harbor approach, every route by which supplies might flow. The Japanese pilots who had been so confident in December 1941, who had flown back to their carriers with the exhilaration of victory singing in their blood, faced a very different reality by 1945. Those who survived, and very few did, watched the empire they had fought for dissolve not in climactic battle but in slow degradation. They flew missions with barely enough fuel to return to base, if they returned at all. They watched comrades die, not from American guns but from engine failure caused by contaminated fuel. They saw the Zeros replaced by older models pulled from training schools because no new aircraft were being produced. They felt the hunger in their own bellies, the same hunger that was killing civilians on the home islands. And some of them, in quiet moments, remembered that December morning in 1941 and wondered what would have been different if they had known. If they had known that America's strength did not lie in its battleships, but in its industrial capacity, its submarines, its willingness to wage total war beneath the sea. If they had known that the sleeping giant they awakened would respond, not with panic, but with systematic, ruthless efficiency. If they had known that the American submarine force would sink more than 1,300 Japanese merchant ships totaling over 5 million tons, destroying 60% of Japan's merchant marine. If they had known that American submarines would also sink 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers, becoming the most effective submarine force in naval history. Would it have mattered? Could it have changed anything? The answer, of course, is no. Japan's decision to go to war in 1941 was not a rational calculation, but a desperate gamble, a decision driven by ideology, by the momentum of militarism, by the belief in destiny and the righteousness of imperial expansion. The men who flew the aircraft over Pearl Harbor were not policymakers. They were instruments of a strategic vision that had already failed before the first bomb fell. But they did not know that in December 1941, they knew only the intoxication of victory, the sight of burning battleships, the radio reports of success cascading across the Pacific as the southern resource area fell into Japanese hands. They believed they were winning. They were, in fact, in the opening moments of a catastrophic defeat that would unfold over 4 years, inflicted not by the battleships they had sunk, but by the submarines they had not seen. In the final accounting, American submarines accounted for approximately 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during World War II, more than aircraft, more than surface ships, more than mines. They did it with less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, taking 3,505 men with them, the highest casualty rate of any branch of American military service, nearly 22%. But in exchange, they destroyed an empire's ability to wage war. They cut the arteries that supplied oil to the war machine, food to the population, resources to the factories. They turned the ocean into a killing field where Japanese merchant sailors sailed with the knowledge that they were probably not coming home. They proved that wars are not won by the clash of battleships, but by the capacity to deliver resources to the fight, and the capacity to deny those resources to the enemy. The submarine campaign against Japan was not glorious. It was not honorable in any traditional sense. It was industrial warfare at its most brutal, the systematic destruction of an enemy's economic capacity to resist. But it worked. There is a memorial at Pearl Harbor on the sunken hull of the battleship Arizona, where 1,177 men remain entombed in the rusting steel. Tourists visit by the thousands, looking down into the water where oil still seeps from the wreck, a black rainbow that will continue for decades more. They remember the attack, the surprise, the infamy of that December morning. But there should also be a memorial, somewhere in the Pacific, to the silent service that avenged that morning. not with grand gestures or dramatic battles, but with patient, relentless hunting in the dark waters. A memorial to the submariners who sailed beneath the waves for weeks at a time, breathing recycled air enduring depth charge, attacks that crushed steel and shattered nerves. Living in cramped steel tubes where the smell of diesel and sweat and fear became the only reality. Men who fired torpedoes at targets they often never saw, who sank ships and then dived deep while destroyers hunted above, who returned to port with empty tubes and silent pride. They did not seek glory, they sought targets. And in finding them, in sinking them, in turning the sea lanes into graveyards, they accomplished what no battleship could. They strangled an empire. The lesson of the American submarine campaign against Japan is not a lesson about naval tactics or torpedo technology. It is a lesson about the nature of modern war. Empires are not sustained by ideology or destiny or martial valor, though all of those matter. Empires are sustained by logistics, by the capacity to feed populations, fuel machines, supply armies. Cut those supply lines, and the empire collapses regardless of how many battles it wins. Japan won every major engagement in the first 6 months of the war. They captured Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Burma. They controlled the resources they had gone to war to obtain, and it meant nothing because they could not move those resources home. The submarines ensured that. Every ton of rubber that did not reach a factory, every barrel of oil that burned at sea instead of powering an aircraft, every grain of rice that fed fish instead of soldiers. These were the increments of defeat. Not glorious, not dramatic, but final. The Japanese pilots who survived the war, who returned to a devastated homeland in August 1945 after the atomic bombs and the surrender, faced a nation transformed. The cities were ash. The factories were silent. The people were starving. The great gamble of 1941 had failed so completely that it seemed, in retrospect, almost fated. And perhaps some of those pilots walking through the ruins of Tokyo or Osaka remembered the morning of December 8, 1941, when they had flown back to their carriers in triumph, believing they had won the war in a single stroke. Perhaps they remembered the sight of the battleships burning, the conviction of destiny, the certainty of victory. And perhaps they understood, finally, that the war had never been about battleships at all. It had been about oil, about supply lines, about the capacity to sustain a war effort across thousands of miles of ocean. And in that war, the war that mattered, Japan had lost before the first shot was fired. The submarines had simply made that loss inevitable. The Pacific remains a graveyard. Thousands of ships rest on the ocean floor, their hulls broken, their cargo spilled, their crews long since gone to bone and memory. Japanese merchantmen, American submarines, the detritus of a war fought in the deep water. The oil that Japan needed, that Japan fought for, that Japan strangled without, still lies beneath the sea in corroding tanks, a toxic legacy of desperation and defeat. And somewhere in that same ocean, entombed in 52 American submarines, are the men who made that defeat possible. They did not live to see memorials or to receive the full measure of recognition they earned. The submarine service has always been the silent service, operating in darkness, beneath notice, doing the grim work that no one wants to acknowledge. But history remembers them now. History understands what they accomplished. They choked an empire. They severed the lifeline. They prove that the greatest weapon in modern war is not the aircraft that flies highest or the ship that mounts the biggest guns, but the capacity to deliver resources and the will to deny them to the enemy. And in doing that, in those dark waters, they changed the world.